Would you consider Nelson a Zionist?
Something to you. I've been watching all your videos as usual. I've been inspired by your videos. I want to read something to you.
Yeah.
What did I do with that book? I got all my books here today. Not all of them. I'm going to read this book to you. I'm going to tell you something. The Rockefellers are Nazis, but the Rockefellers will do anything. They'll do anything for power, whatever it takes. Okay, I'm going to read this to you because I've been watching your videos. And what did I tell you? All roads lead to Rockefeller. I'm going to read this to you from David Rockefeller. These are David Rockefeller's words. Initially, Chase's business with Israel was quite limited. We had a corresponding relationship with the Israeli central bank and a small number of private banks, but the flow of business was limited largely because the socialists who dominated Israeli government for almost 30 years were not especially welcoming to foreign banks. However, one financial connection was of great significance for both Chase and Israel. In 1951, the Israeli government selected Chase as the American fiscal agent for Israeli bonds. The sale of these bonds produced a huge flow of funds critical to Israel's economic development. Chase handled the interest payment on these bonds and provide other custodial services for a fee, a business that turned out to be quite profitable and also strengthened our relationship with Jewish organizations in America.
Wow.
Now, you want to redo that video about Israeli bonds? Here's where it all ties. Let me read you about Gordon Dean. He died in a plane crash in 1958. Senior Vice President, Nuclear Energy, General Dynamics. So were they not selling these bonds to build Dimona? Now, here's the thing. Was a member of the panel, he was a member of the Rockefeller panel, which was the blueprint, the Rockefeller blueprint, when the Rockefellers wanted to federalize the world under Rockefeller rule. Okay. Well, until he died in a plane crash. We got Nelson Rockefeller, chairman of the panel, right? And who else? Robert Giuliani, Secretary of the Treasury for Eisenhower. Giuliani sent him to jail for laundering drug money. His office, Anderson Group, was a front, was in the same building with General Dynamics. General Dynamics in 1963, throughout the 60s, was where? Rockefeller Center. Okay, so he's vice president. Now, here's something you got to understand. Who ran General Dynamics? He ties to the Hilton Hotel. Henry Crown. Yeah. Okay, there's a lot of stuff out there. Okay, he merged his company with a super high-tech defense contractor, the most lethal system, which includes the nuclear subs, of course. Okay, they weren't building nuclear. They were not in nuclear to help build Israel, to build Dimona. That's why he took over General Dynamics. He wanted the facilities to build Dimona, to build a nuclear defense for Israel. Yeah, you see how it all goes back? All right, here's what happened. There was a Chicago gangster, 1946. He was gunned down in the streets of Chicago at State Street in broad daylight. They opened up with machine gun fires. Machine gun fire was the Chicago outfit, the gang that couldn't. The mafia is the gang that couldn't shoot straight. They opened up with machine gun, Tommy guns. He survived the shooting. He died in the hospital 3 days later of mercury poisoning, which possibly could have been some of these gangsters used to dip their bullets in mercury. I don't know. We don't know. Anyways, he identified a shooters, David Yarez and Lenny Patrick, both hoodlum gangster friends of Jack Ruby. So how much was Ruby involved in this killing? Okay. Look at this. See what was going on here. Here's the background was going on here. It was alleged that Henry Crown, Walter Annenberg, and people connected with the Hilton Hotel gave the order to kill James Reagan because James Reagan was running the race wire for horse race, off-track betting, quasi-legal. And these guys wanted to take it over. After, I believe Roosevelt was protecting James Reagan. And after Roosevelt died, these gangsters went after him. Now, Bobby Kennedy, here's some of the background you can understand. This is why a great part why the Kennedys died. What was going on in this country? You got to understand the background here. If you had enough money and enough connections, you could hire somebody, have somebody killed, and you'd never have any fear of being caught. Well, if you read Bobby Kennedy's book, The Enemy Within, if you read Walt Sheridan's book, okay, The Enemy Within, and not The Enemy Within, Walt Sheridan's book, which was The Plot to Kill the President, and Walt Sheridan's book was The Fall and Rise of Jimmy Hoffa. Bobby Blakey's book was
The Plot to Kill the President.
Those two guys worked for the Kennedy Justice Department. They all wrote about the same thing, that in America, if you had enough money, enough connections, you could pay and have somebody killed and not worry about being caught. Example, Chicago, 1,027 what they call gangland-style murders, never solved, including James Reagan, also the murder of Leon Cook, which was greatly connected to Jack Ruby, and also 1963, the murder of Benjamin Lewis, which was connected to David Yowers as well. They bludgeoned him to death. He got caught on an FBI wire talking. Never prosecuted, but lead suspect. And they believed the board of directors, meaning Henry Crown and these guys. So Bobby, you know, when I was a little kid, my father, when I was in a room of adults and adults were talking, these subjects came up. This was like the murder of Albert Anastasia. Bobby talked about Albert Anastasia, right?
Mm-hmm.
He was shot 10 times sitting in a barber chair in a luxury hotel in New York City in broad daylight. No one ever prosecuted. So people were discussing these things, okay? We still discuss these things. Now, I'm a kid. I'm going to Catholic school. Thou shalt not kill, right? First commandment. Well, how do adults explain this to kids? Well, here's how they would explain it. Well, these people only kill each other, okay? All right. And if you don't get involved with them, and you stay out of trouble, you don't have to worry about these people. Right. And then they would go on and say, well, America's the greatest country in the world, and everybody wants to come here and live. And well, if the American way, if this is something unwanted part of the American way, distasteful part of the American way, then you got to accept it. Well, Bobby Kennedy wasn't going to accept it. Bobby was going to prosecute these gangland-style murders. And what he was doing, he went after Murder Incorporated, Albert Anastasia, although he was dead. But what Bobby did, he was going into these big cities, Chicago, Murder Incorporated, and looking for songbirds. Well, they had the songbird in Joe Valachi. Okay, Joe Valachi, his mouth sent a lot of people to prison for a lot, maybe even the electric chair. And Joe Valachi was the guy who was the driver, famous mob murder of Joe the Boss Masseria. He was gunned down in an Italian restaurant, which included Charles Luciani, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Bugsy Siegel, and Joe Adonis. Well, Joe Adonis, according to Emmanuel Josephson, my mentor, who's white, he's a mentor to me, he was the labor boss for the building of Rockefeller Center. So if anybody wants to talk about strikes or work stoppages, these guys are going to threaten them. And boy, they kept their promises. Okay, here we got this. Here's an article. So Bobby was looking to build in the Chicago outfit. He was looking to get a songbird. He was targeting Sam Giancana. He was putting tremendous pressure on Sam Giancana. He had FBI guys follow him wherever he went. If he went to the bathroom, they followed him to the bathroom. He walked on the golf course, they followed him on the obvious tail. Okay, and it was, of course, because of that, nobody in the underworld were all distancing themselves from Sam Giancana. But here's an article published. Well, there's a lot out there on this. There's a lot out here on this. There's tons of stuff. But anyway, I wanted to talk about this guy here. Here it is. Here's another article. I think this was published. Well, there's a lot of songbird. Can you read that?
Mm-hmm.
Songbird was murdered. Okay, he starts right out. I gotta put my glasses on here. He starts right out talking about who? The recent singing of Joe Valachi regarding underworld oversight recalls the death of a man for which indirectly, I was responsible. Then he go, I dropped in at the morgue at Chicago's American to refresh my memory. There it was in a dusty clipping. I think he's going back in the file. The account of how James Reagan, head of the Continental Press and Racing Wire, died 1946 after being machine gunned down from a fruit truck on Chicago Street intersection. The clipping brought back memories of other events identical with Joe Valachi. It goes, James Reagan, before he died, had told me the same thing, only more so, which was why he died. 1946, 4 years before the Kefauver probe, I saw Reagan in Chicago. He gave me the story of Chicago mob rule with permission to take it to Attorney General Tom Clark. The story was a sordid one. He goes on and on about restaurants and hotels. I don't want to go on and on about this. But anyways, see, this is what was going on. The Kefauver Committee, he took to Washington, he took a 96-page dissertation that Reagan had written on the underworld, all right?
Who did?
And took it. Drew Pearson, who was a big Kennedy supporter and progressive Democrat, and a big count, there's a lot out there on this, took this 96-page dissertation that James Reagan reported to Drew Pearson. He took it to Tom Clark, Attorney General, and the FBI. What did they do with it? It got lost. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. So he was looking. So, anyways, Bobby Kennedy, he mentions Kefauver Committee. See, the Kefauver Committee reopened the case of James Reagan. They questioned Jack Ruby, the staff did.
That's right.
And another witness turned up dead. So Bobby Kennedy was hot on the tails. The people implied, there's another article, Drew Pierce, General Dynamics, Henry Crown has another fight. See, here we're going to get into this check by Bobby Baker. Let me tell you, Henry Crown was the second biggest owner in Hilton Hotels. Trace it back when he owned the Flamingo, right? Famously connected to who? Bugsy Siegel, the man who, same people who shot Joe Boss Masseria. So he goes down here. While the Senate is haggling over the question of whether General Dynamics should have received the almost $7 billion contract, the TFX fighter plane, another argument has been dragged out of Chicago courts to whether Henry Crown owns as much of General Dynamics as generally believed. See, here he goes. See the Hilton. Here's what he got. He's talking about Henry Crown owns the Empire State Building, Rock Island Railroad, or at least big part ownership of it. The second largest owner in the Hilton hotel chain, and the largest stockholder in Material Services and General Dynamics. Material Service was his gravel business. He was selling gravel in Chicago. He merged it in with General Dynamics. Now, this article, some woman claimed that her husband gave him $5,000 to get in the business, and he screwed him. So they took him to court on this issue. But this is then again, Drew Pearson was hot on the heels of this Henry Crown. Nobody knows his name. So here's what I'm saying. Bobby Kennedy was pursuing these people who gave the order to kill James Reagan. All right. Henry Crown, Walter Annenberg, and the Hilton Hotel, which are one and the same. Now, the Hilton Hotel in New York City in 1963, that was their hotel, their flagship hotel. The building was put up by the Rockefellers, 45 stories tall. President Kennedy actually stayed here in 63, as did the Beatles, before they went on the insult. Okay, now we go to two things. The testimony of Robert Easterling and the testimony of Don Reynolds. This goes back to the Bobby Baker scandal story, okay? And a lot of tons of headlines. This was like Watergate. The story broke. I remember a kid listening to this on the news about this. Johnson asserts he took stereo as innocent gift. Explains phonograph was only one of presents he and Baker exchanged. You know, this was an exchange. See, this was in the New York Times, 1964. Don Reynolds' testimony. Okay. Don Reynolds claimed that he was in Dallas and Bobby Baker showed him a suitcase with $100,000 in cash. And along with the stereo, okay, and the stereo is what made the headlines, not so much the suitcase full of money, but this $100,000 payoff to Johnson. Okay, Reynolds also told of seeing a suitcase full of money, which Baker described as a $100,000 payoff to Johnson for his role in securing the Fort Worth TFX contract. That was almost a $7 billion contract in Fort Worth. Now, he went to Washington. So there's a hearing going on in Washington in the Senate by Senator McClellan, and they're before the Rules Committee. Well, he said it right here, the Rules Committee, the senators, and he was shown this check. The check was signed by General Dynamics.
Who was shown the check?
Senator McClellan was shown a check signed by General Dynamics for $100,000, okay, from the city of Dallas, was sent to New Orleans, converted into cash, then sent back to Dallas. Senator McClellan was shown this check about this $100,000. It came from General Dynamics. Well, he didn't say here, but he says, he didn't say General Dynamics, but he says the TFX contract with General Dynamics landed. Now, let's go to the testimony. Oh, by the way, this happened the day Kennedy was shot. Senator McClellan actually got called out to the front office and told he came back. Well, anyways, all this stuff got put on hold. This check probably still exists. It's a paper record. Okay, so it exists in the Federal Reserve Bank. The record of it would exist. This is admissible in court. Let me read this to you. According to what Easterling says, the businessman told him, and what Easterling learned from the company employees, the $100,000 in clean, untraceable cash, clean mean untraceable, had been raised for a wealthy Dallas oil man with whom the company had did business. Okay, well, we got a lot of wealthy Dallas oil men in the story. Okay, but here, the funds were presumably transferred by check through normal billing procedures. They represented overcharges and overpayments supposedly spaced out over time for illicit billings to escape routine audits. The actual cash came from a supermarket whose manager was cooperative about furnishing soiled currency. In other words, stuff's been in currency. Okay, about 10 o'clock that Sunday morning, two men arrived at the business office. One was the person Easterling believed to be Clay Shaw, okay, who in reality might have been Guy Bannister. The second was a man from Dallas named Jack Ruby. Well, here's the thing, and I'm going to tell you it was Clay Shaw, and I'm going to tell you, if we get time, why I know it was Clay Shaw. Okay. The men checked the cash in the suitcase. Ruby then went to the telephone and placed a call to a man in Dallas. After some perfunctory conversation, Ruby handed the telephone to his companion, who spoke for several minutes. He then hung up. At one point, the businessman asked Ruby if he was going to be able to take care of so much cash. According to Easterling, Ruby pulled back his suit jacket and pointed to his pistol and said, "Yeah, I got my little heater." Hurt never mentioned who the company was. And he never mentioned there was another guy here. As Ruby and his companions left, Easterling looked out at their car and saw two men sitting in it. He believed they were Manuel Rivera and the Cuban known to Easterling as Joe. Now, I believe Joe was Sergio Arcata Smith. So anyways, the testimony of Robert Easterling lines up with the collaboration of Don Reynolds. And of course, Don Reynolds, when Kennedy died, who's in charge now? Johnson. Johnson, when he was on his way to Dallas, was up to his neck in alligators. He had this Bobby Baker scandal going, and he also had the scandal concerning Billy Souls Estes, which involved, of course, the murder of Mr. Marshall, who was, you know that story.
The agriculture.
Kennedy, before he left dial, before he left Washington, he told his secretary, Evelyn Lincoln,
Right.
he says, Johnson's off the ticket. Okay. So Johnson was not only looking at this guy was the number 2 man in Washington. He was majority leader of the United States Senate. He was about to be destroyed politically. And he was looking at, because of all these investigations, he was looking at serious jail time until bam, Kennedy's head exploded in Dealey Plaza. Now he's president, so a president cannot be prosecuted. And he brought down all his wrath. They ran a scathing attack on Don Reynolds. Hoover had a file on him. This guy, Don Reynolds, was a Washington insider. He was a wartime intelligence officer, just like all the rest. Clay Shaw, Allen Dulles, Tracy Barnes, Richard Helms, they're all wartime military officers. I mean, intelligence officers. Hoover had a file on him from World War II. So Johnson unleashed that. They ran a huge destruction campaign against him. So Johnson got totally clear. Of course, Bobby Baker took the fall, went to jail for 18 months. But 5 years after Johnson safely died, Bobby Baker said everything Don Reynolds said was absolutely true. Yeah. All right. I want to go to the 3 names on this check. I figured it out who the 3rd name is. The payee, the name across the middle. I know who it is now.
Who was getting then?
The man who pulled the trigger to kill Kennedy. It went to Bobby Baker. Listen, Johnson would have paid $1 million to kill Kennedy. This guy, the Kennedy, were going to destroy him, just like they destroyed Jimmy Hoffa. They said Jimmy Hoffa. Well, and then again, Estes Kefauver sent who to prison? Frank Costello, the big don and the big boss of New York City. They're taking these guys down. And not only the people who pulled the triggers, but the people who gave the order. Bobby's not stupid now. It wasn't going to just go send the people pull the trigger. He wanted the people to pull the triggers to name higher ups. That's why he was putting pressure on Sam Giancana, because Sam Giancana was in charge of the stable of assassins in the Chicago outfit. See? So if that shooting involving David Yaris and Lenny Patrick, Sam Giancana must have been arranging it. That's why Bobby wanted Sam Giancana. He wanted to take down Henry Crown. He wanted to take down these top guys. Witnesses saw David Yaris, Jack Ruby's hoodlum friend from Chicago, in Ruby's, well, whatever you want to call it, nightclub, stripper club, whatever it was, sleazy joint or what it was. And the witnesses placed him there. And these guys had not seen each other in a long time. Plus, witness saw David Yaris publicly out eating with Jimmy Hoffa. There's 2 men who wanted to bring Kennedy down more than anybody, was Johnson and Hoffa. Now, Ruby's phone records said that he was talking to a lot of people connected with Hoffa, including people, I don't like to keep, in this book that Bobby Kennedy talked about, that Bobby Kennedy mentioned had phone calls to Jack Ruby in the days leading up to the JFK assassination. Now, the 2 guys, got it here someplace. I've been doing a deeper dive and I had the list of the people on the Warren Commission here, but Griffin and Huber, right? They were assigned to cover Jack Ruby. Well, they told them, they tapped them on the show, we don't need you. As soon as they started asking questions, they tapped them and said, we don't need you here anymore, go home. And they're the ones that subpoenaed Ruby's phone records. And he had conversations with, Barney Baker, that's his name. It was a conspiracy because how would the FBI put cuffs on these people? Barney Baker was just released from jail just before the Kennedy assassination. The FBI put cuffs on these guys. They don't know this. So obviously the government was involved in the conspiracy and in the conspiracy to cover the truth. I'm going to say one thing about David Yaris. I do believe he was in Dealey Plaza. He was in Jack Ruby's bar. But what they were doing, the plot was to blame this thing on Castro, and they were going to drive Ruby in Mexico or to Mexico or towards Mexico, and they were going to execute him. Not Ruby. Ruby was in charge of getting Oswald out of Dallas, and David Yaris and some of his. Then again, they've got to kill Bobby to protect themselves because Bobby was coming after him. And also was that fresh murder in 1963 of Benjamin Lewis, who was a Chicago alderman, black Chicago alderman. So Bobby was definitely going to go after these guys. So they had to kill Bobby. So Ruby's responsibility was to get Oswald out of Dallas and execute him. And Yarez and who else probably involved with it. I'm sure Giancana was involved because he's the guy who's arranging a lot of the stuff. And of course, Easterling, that was his job. He was going to drive Oswald out of Dallas. But he called the FBI. And the FBI knew all about this guy. They knew his make, model, license plate number of his car. They knew all his. That's why they were able to pick Oswald up so quick, because they knew all about it. They knew the whole story. And they told Easterling, we know all about it, but we're going to catch these guys red-handed. Well, that's, Earl Warren, this is corroborated, because Earl Warren left an open letter, right? And he said if Hoover had done his job, or the FBI had done their job, the president would be alive. This all corroborates what Easterling was saying.
Yeah.
Okay. So Yaris was definitely in Dealey Plaza, or most likely was. So who's killing these people? There's still an ongoing cover-up. They're not, until recently, until public clamor, they were blocking these documents from coming out. There's been an ongoing cover of 1963. Who's doing this? Israel?
Well.
All right, where are we? And I believe, Jimmy Hoffa disappeared like 6 weeks after Sam Giancana was shot, who was supposed to go before the church committee. And they shot him in the basement of his home, and they shot him basically sending messages. They shot him multiple times in the mouth, meaning to keep your mouth shut. They sent a message.
Yeah.
Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. Believed to be put in an oil can, 50-gallon oil can, either dumped in Lake Michigan or taken to New Jersey and buried in
the concrete.
Part of the success that the Kennedys, their success in public office, getting elected, comes because of these investigation of organized crime figures. Maybe the American people were fed up with this stuff, and the Kennedys were going to do something. They were prosecuting these people, and that helped them gain the White House. That helped them gain the Senate. You see what I'm saying? So prosecuting these people is part of the reason why the Kennedys got elected. Even Keith Hoffa ran for president. I think he ran against Kennedy in '60. He ran for president. His shows were televised. The McClellan committee was televised. So now you got the Kennedys standing up there supposedly prosecuting the mob in the underworld, and people think, well, this is a good thing. We're getting these evil people out of society. So you see my point? What Manuel Joseph said, I give him the credit for what he did, and he made me realize that the Rockefellers never relinquished control of the petroleum industry. Okay, that what they did, they took their foundations, they created the Rockefeller Foundation in 1913. They did three things. They passed the 16th Amendment to impose income tax unconstitutionally on the American people. They set up the Federal Reserve Bank. Well, that's why they imposed income tax, to bail out the Federal Reserve Bank. Because we taxpayers, anytime there's a whole history of that too, of the Rockefellers and setting up the Federal Reserve Bank. See, we as taxpayers have to bail them out. And then he set up the Rockefeller Foundation. And they transferred their shares into the Rockefeller Foundation, which was where? Where was the headquarters for the Rockefeller Foundation? Next door to, down the hallway from Standard Oil boardroom, okay? So it's still a Rockefeller-run organization. There's no oversight entities or anything. Oh, we gave all our money away and we're just going to collect art and whatever and help humanity. No truth to it. But Emanuel Joseph gave me understand that this was just a ploy on their part. Okay, that they never really did relinquish control, and this is part of the reasons also the Kennedys died. Right? We talked about. I don't want to get too much into this because it gets up in a whole new chapter. But Bobby, see, when you start investigating, I talk about the Carnegie Endowment, who's on the Warren Commission. Okay, everybody who killed Kennedy were all represented on the Warren Commission. Okay,
yeah, that's an interesting point.
Let me read you something about McCloy. This is how these Rockefeller criminals operate. Here it goes. I was disappointed that Jack, he calls him Jack, and I never developed a close personal friendship. Okay, listen to this. All right, there's a whole section here. Nelson reportedly told him the family, quote, had used its influence to make him chairman, that's the Chase Bank, the Rockefeller Bank, and that one of his jobs was to ensure that David would succeed him when he retired. See, this is the secret game. These people are stealthy. This is the game they play. They have tremendous wealth, tremendous influence, and they're always in the background manipulating, and people are not aware that they're being targeted by these criminals. And this guy's on the Warren Commission. David Rockefeller standing. And also, George Marinci, if you read his testimony or you read, he mentions the Chase Bank as one of his financiers. Oh, was David Rockefeller ever asked about that? No. Richard Russell, of the 7 people, if you look at the makeup of the Warren Commission, these are not Lyndon Johnson's good old boys from Texas, Sweet 8F. The only one I might give you is Richard Russell. He was close to Johnson. But here's the thing.
Okay.
When Johnson put him on the commission, he declined. Russell declined. I don't want no part of it. So Johnson released his name to the press, the media.
Wow.
I doubt if he ever showed up to many meetings or nothing must have involved him. But I think he was the one guy who questioned the validity of the miracle bullet, the single bullet theory, right? Wasn't he?
He does. There's a recording of that. All right.
John McCloy, top lawyer for the Rockefellers. He grew up with the Rockefeller boys. He used to go to their home in Seal Harbor, Maine, and spend summers with the Rockefeller boys and teach them how to sail. He was their stand-in. He sat on the boards of 25 corporations. That's how the Rockefellers ruled this country. They have their stand-ins just like they did here. Good thing that's metal. But this, just like they have the stand, see, just like they manipulated this thing for David to get him out of the board. They don't outright own these corporations. They just manipulate them. Same with Standard Oil. They never had a sole, that was never a sole proprietorship. There was other stockholders, but they manipulate, see? But where am I now? Okay, so John McCloy, the top lawyer for the Rockefeller, also a stand-in, also what? Chairman of the Ford Foundation. See?
Yeah.
Now, who was Secretary of Defense? McNamara, Ford Motor Company president. And McNamara, if you read some of these articles about General Dynamics, about him, he was pushing for General Dynamics to get this contract. This was the biggest airplane contract in the department history, the Defense Department's history. So Boeing wanted it, Lockheed wanted it. Who else was out there? General McDonnell Douglas was the Rockefellers pretty much controlled. That was one they controlled. But General Dynamics got it. See, he was pushing for General Dynamics. It came out in these in his congressional hearings in '64.
Okay.
Plus, who else was there? Alan Dulles. Alan Dulles was a Ford Foundation trustee, right? And if you know, this is on the record that the CIA and the Ford Foundation was funding CIA covert operations. Okay, it's on the record now using Ford Foundation money. We don't know a lot of details about that stuff. Okay, so you got Ford being represented, Ford Foundation. Alan Dulles was representing the CIA. He was representing Ford Motor Company. And the Rockefellers too, because they were solving the crime well. They're serving Rockefeller corporations. Okay, they were their German agents. You know when John Foster Dulles ran for the Senate, he got painted a Nazi, but that's another story. I'm going to tell you a story about John Sherman Cooper.
You don't hear about him much. Go ahead.
No, he's Skull and Bones. Skull and Bones participated in the Kennedy assassination. George Bush was photographed in Dealey Plaza wearing his preppy New England clothes, right? Look at all the Skull and Bones. Henry Luce comes in and steals the Zavruta film so nobody can see it. Skull and Bones. And Time Life, headquartered where? Rockefeller Center. Also, J. Richardson Dilworth. Okay. J. Richardson Dilworth, I wish I had that list here now. I'm going to use my memory
That's
now.
all right.
J. Richardson Dilworth ran the family office for the Rockefellers. Skull and Bones. Okay. Now, he had one employee. His name was William Coleman. William Coleman. I wish I had that list. He's on the Warren Commission, one of these 14 assistant counsels. 14 assistant counsels.
Yeah.
He worked for J. Richardson Dilworth, who's Skull and Bones. He's on the Warren Commission. He's one of 14 along with Alan Specter. We could talk about more and more. So there it is. They were representing Skull and Bones. If you know the story, Richard Nixon called Johnson, okay, says, why don't you put Gerald Ford on the Warren Commission? Well, who was super close with Jimmy Hoffa? Richard Nixon. Who commuted Jimmy Hoffa's sentence? President Richard Nixon. Come on, Ford was also the guy. I wish I was more organized. Ford was also the supposedly Hoover's guy on the Warren Commission because Johnson wanted the FBI's conclusions and the Warren Commission findings to mirror each other, right?
Correct. So, hey, Gerald Ford, by the way, born in Nebraska, born Leslie Lynch King Jr. I just think that's kind of weird. He changes his name.
Yeah, here's William Thaddeus Coleman Jr. Nixon made him secretary. Ford made him Secretary of Commerce. He worked for J. Richards and Dilworth, Skull and Bones. J. Richards and Dilworth ran the family office. J. Richards and Dilworth was the guy who came out behind the Rockefeller veil. When Nelson Rockefeller went for his confirmation hearing, he got up and explaining why Nelson Rockefeller's conflict of interest were not conflicts of interest. Of course, what John Rockefeller said, he goes, I'm going to put all my, if you want me to, I'm going to take all my financial holdings and put it in a blind trust. Now, I don't know if that ever happened. But Nelson Rockefeller was left two foundations, private foundation trusts from his grandfather. And who was the director of the trust or the trustee? It was Mac Bundy. Okay. I just wanted to see if they were lawyers or not.
Yeah.
They made the American people think this was an investigation. You got 30 lawyers on this thing. Not one forensic investigator. Not even close. Here's another name here. I found out something about Bellin. He was executive, director of the Rockefeller Commission. There was a whole series of investigations during the 70s of American intelligence. Let's start with Watergate, somewhat. Now we go to Church Committee. They're all Democrats now. See, remember, we talked about this before. The Republicans were friendly with the gangsters. They were pro-gangster. Why? Because they were using the gangsters to flush the Reds, the radicals, whatever you want to call it, people who were driving hard for greater wages for the rank and file, okay? They were using these gangsters to drive them out of the Union. Case in point, the murder of Leon Cook or the murder of Peter Panto. Tell you who Hale Boggs was protecting. Now, I wanted to get to this. The other name on that check, Hale Boggs was protecting Clay Shaw. I'm going to tell you why. I just figured this out, probably because of your video. I want to say one thing about the linen truck. There were certain industries in this country, going back to Prohibition, and we could also bring in the story of MCA Corporation, that these businesses that went into the speakeasies, the gangsters took them over. One was soft drinks. Yeah. Because back in the day, alcohol, people were, let's say, bathtub gin, you couldn't drink it. So they would try and find ways so people get it down. They were using soft drinks, one of the ways. And another business was the linen business. It was another business. There's a huge chapter with Jimmy Hoffa and the corrupt linen industry in Detroit there. I forget kind of something. If you get into damn Moldia's books. Harold Boggs, Clay Shaw. I'll tell you how Harold Boggs was protecting Clay Shaw. It's going on forever.
No. Okay. Is this you want you? Oh, yeah.
About Johnson's up to his neck in alligators, and they were talking about this check I told you about. Guess who the bank was? It was the Continental Bank of Fort Worth that was handling all the money for General Dynamics.
Fred Korth.
President or chairman of the board of the bank.
Really?
You see that?
Yeah. Yes.
Fred Korth was one of LBJ's biggest supporters.
Really? Oh, that guy knew a lot.
They were running a money laundering out of system. And he was appointed Secretary of the Navy by John Kennedy, President Kennedy, to replace Connally. Did you know that? Neither guy stayed in the post long. But This is why they were pushing for General Dynamics, because nuclear power. He got in a fight because he wanted to nuclearize the entire Navy with Kennedy. Doesn't this go back to Dimona and Henry Crown? Also, he lived where? He had a home in Foxhall. Who else lived in Foxhall? Nelson Rockefeller. I mean, he had a home there. He had a colonial era home there. Later known as the F-1, the contract for which had been awarded to General Dynamics. He's talking tactical fighter. And he goes on, oh, here's something else. Did you know? Now, this your friend Corey would know this. Do you know, does this the name Edward Eckdell ring a bell to you?
Yeah.
Yeah. One of his better cases was a small one handled in 48 in the county of Tarrant, Texas, when his client, Edwin Eckdell, was officially divorced from Marguerite Frances Claveri Eckdell, also known as Marguerite Oswell, whose son from a previous marriage. Yeah, I thought that was interesting. So he was not only head of this bank, okay, this Continental Bank of Fort Worth. Yeah, the Continental National Bank of Fort Worth, Texas, handling all the money for General Dynamics. See, but he was also what, on the board of Bell Helicopter. Well, who worked for Bell Helicopter? Albert Jenner was on the board, 1963. Okay, here's this. This is from Wikipedia page.
That's a good
Jenner
source.
had a history of representing figures from Jack Rubenstein's, aka Jack Ruby, criminal milieu, International Brotherhood of Teamsters, Central States Pension Fund, the close associates with Jimmy Hoffa, and other organized crime via the Chicago outfit. Thorfinn was convicted on several felony counts and was murdered in 83. Jenner was counsel for General Dynamics in 1963. That's the year they killed Kennedy, right?
Mm-hmm.
When it was deeply involved in a series of scandals in Texas that were exposed by the United States Department of Justice. That's Bobby Kennedy.
Yeah.
He was a Warren Commission member. Here, Jenner served on the board of General Dynamics. He was a friend of attorney for the family of Henry Crown. Jenner represented Lester Crown, president of Material Service Corporation, which was their gravel company, in a 1972 bribery scandal, and obtained for him client immunity from prosecution in exchange for cooperating with the grand jury. So what does that mean? Lester Crown was ratting out his friends. Then it goes on, something about Nixon, things. Yeah, so he's the guy. Wait a minute. He's the guy who questioned George Marinsheeds. Yeah. According to Bruce Adamson, that Albert Jenner and George Marinsheed had, before they went on record, they had a series of meetings where they discussed Nelson Rockefeller. Whereas Nelson Rockefeller's name was never brought up, but his banks were, and his oil companies were, and his friends were. See how they're covering for the Rockefeller?